Uncle Harrison smiled. Congrats on buying that $750,000 estate in cash. My sister stopped bragging. My parents exchanged panicked looks. Dad whispered, "What estate?" I sipped my wine. I am 35 years old, and for the vast majority of my existence, I have been a ghost. Not the kind that haunts a creepy old mansion or rattles chains in the middle of the night. No, I am the kind of ghost that sits right next to you at the dinner table, passes you the salt, and completely fades into the wallpaper. In the field of psychology, they have a term for it. They call it being a glass child. It means you are the sibling who is seen right through, the one whose needs, accomplishments, and very presence are rendered entirely invisible by the overwhelming glare of another sibling. In my family, that blinding light is my younger sister, Mackenzie. Mackenzie is 32, and from the moment she took her first breath, the universe, or at least the universe contained within my parents' house, revolved exclusively around her. If Mackenzie sneezed, it was a symphony. If I won a state-level science fair, it was an inconvenience because it meant my parents had to drive me to the auditorium and miss Mackenzie's junior cheerleading practice. Growing up, the dynamic was established early and enforced with ruthless consistency. Mackenzie was the golden girl, the loud, vibrant, demanding center of attention who could do absolutely no wrong. I was the quiet, low-maintenance afterthought. The reliable background noise. The financial disparity in our upbringing was perhaps the most glaring evidence of where my parents' priorities lay. When Mackenzie turned 16, there was a shiny new convertible sitting in the driveway with a massive red bow on the hood. I remember watching her scream and jump up and down from the living room window. When I turned 16, my father handed me a plastic transit card with exactly $50 loaded onto it and told me I should start looking for an after-school job to pay for my own gas if I wanted to borrow the old family minivan. I did not cry. I did not throw a tantrum. Even back then, I possessed a strange, quiet acceptance of my role in the family ecosystem. My father, Gordon, is a man who values optics above all else. He measures success by what you can show off to the neighbors. Mackenzie, with her loud personality and constant drama, gave him endless material to discuss at the country club. My mother, Brenda, is a woman who views her daughters not as independent human beings, but as extensions of her own ego. Mackenzie was her mini-me, her do-over, her best friend. I was just the other one. Over the years, I learned to shrink myself. I learned that bringing up my own needs only resulted in heavy sighs, rolled eyes, and lectures about how I was being selfish or demanding. So, I stopped asking. I stopped sharing. I stopped expecting them to be the parents I actually needed. I became completely self-sufficient because the alternative was drowning in the sheer disappointment of their neglect. And that self-sufficiency, born out of profound isolation, would eventually become the very weapon I used to build an empire they could not even begin to comprehend. The voicemail arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying the familiar, slightly nasal tone of my mother's passive-aggressive authority. I let it play on speakerphone as I stood in my kitchen. She did not ask if I was free. She did not ask how I was doing. The message simply stated that her 60th birthday dinner was being held at an obscenely expensive downtown steakhouse this coming Saturday at 7 o'clock sharp. Then came the kicker, the little needle hidden in the cotton. She added, "And Penelope, please try to find something nice to wear. Mackenzie is bringing a few of her friends from her new corporate office, and I do not want them thinking you are struggling. Just try to look presentable for once, dear." I did not delete the message immediately. I listened to it twice, letting the sheer audacity of her words wash over me. They truly believed I was a failure. Because I drove a practical car, because I didn't post flashy vacations on social media, and because I lived a quiet life away from their constant chaotic orbit, they had firmly categorized me as the family's tragic underachiever. And the most beautiful part of it all? I let them believe it. I cultivated that illusion with meticulous care. Later that evening, I drove to a high-end boutique in the city to purchase her birthday gift. I knew exactly what she wanted. For months, she had been dropping aggressive hints on her Facebook page about a specific imported crystal vase that cost an absurd amount of money. I walked into the brightly lit store, dressed in my standard weekend attire of faded jeans and a plain gray sweater. The sales associate gave me a quick, dismissive once-over before returning to her phone, clearly assuming I could not afford anything on the display floor. I did not mind. Being underestimated was my comfort zone. I found the vase, a heavy, intricate piece of cut glass that caught the light like a diamond. I carried it to the register. The total came to exactly $850. The cashier looked at me with a raised eyebrow, waiting for me to inevitably pull out a credit card that would decline. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope. I counted out 9 crisp $100 bills, pushing them across the glass counter. I told her to keep the change. I always paid for family-related expenses in cold, hard cash. No bank statements. No digital footprints. No way for them to ever accidentally trace my financial reality. As I carried the heavy box back to my car, I felt a quiet thrill of anticipation. The dinner was going to be agonizing, an endless parade of Mackenzie's fabricated accomplishments and my parents' fawning adoration. But this time I was walking into the lion's den with a secret so massive, so completely life-altering, that just the knowledge of it felt like wearing a suit of bulletproof armor. While my family pictured me getting ready for the dinner in some cramped, moldy studio apartment on the wrong side of town, the reality was violently different. I stood in front of the mirror, but the reflection was framed by custom-cut, floor-to-ceiling glass. I was standing in the master bathroom of my new home. A sprawling, magnificent estate located in the highly exclusive, gated community of Pinecrest. The bathroom alone was larger than the entire first floor of my parents' house. It featured heated marble floors, a freestanding copper-soaking tub, and a dual-head rainfall shower. Everything was silent, insulated, and perfectly still. It was the smell of wealth, the scent of fresh paint, polished cedar, and absolute, undeniable security. And the best part? I didn't owe a single dime to anyone for it. I had purchased the property 3 weeks ago for exactly $750,000, entirely in cash. No mortgage. No lingering debt. Just a wire transfer that finalized a decade of unrelenting, brutal discipline. As I stared at my reflection, my mind drifted back to the only person in my family who ever actually saw me. Grandma Josephine. She was my father's mother, a tough, pragmatic woman who survived the Great Depression and possessed a terrifyingly sharp intuition. When I was younger, she was the only one who noticed when Mackenzie stole my toys or when my parents forgot to pick me up from school. Before she passed away, when I was 25 years old, she pulled me close to her hospital bed. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were like lasers. She told me she was leaving me a trust. Not a fortune, but a substantial sum of $150,000. I remember her exact words, raspy but firm. "Do not tell your mother," she whispered. "Brenda will bleed you dry to fund Mackenzie's nonsense. Your father is too weak to stop her. Take this money, Penelope. Disappear into the background. Build a fortress. Do not build a facade like your mother. Build walls of brick and stone, so thick that they can never hurt you again." She died 2 days later. My mother inherited the bulk of the estate and, predictably, blew through it in less than 2 years on a luxury kitchen remodel, a month-long European cruise, and a depreciating Mercedes-Benz that she ultimately had to trade in because she couldn't afford the maintenance. I, on the other hand, took my $150,000 and vanished into the financial ether. I took Grandma Josephine's advice as gospel. I didn't buy a car. I didn't buy designer clothes. I took that money, planted it in the dirt, and spent the next 10 years watering it with my own blood, sweat, and absolute isolation. I was about to walk into a room full of people who thought I was a pathetic charity case, while I held the deed to a small kingdom. The road from Grandma Josephine's inheritance to the marble floors of Pinecrest was not paved with easy choices. It was paved with a decade of dirt, discipline, and a lifestyle so Spartan it would make a monk flinch. When I received that $150,000 at age 25, the temptation to escape my circumstances immediately was overwhelming. I could have bought a nice condo. I could have upgraded my life. But I remembered her words. A fortress. You don't build a fortress by spending your foundation. For 10 years, from age 25 to 35, I lived in a rundown, one-bedroom apartment in the industrial district on the far south side of the city. It was a neighborhood my parents and sister would not even drive through, let alone visit. The rent was dirt cheap, and for good reason. The walls were paper thin, the plumbing groaned like a dying animal every time I turned on the faucet, and I spent the first 2 years battling a relentless family of rats that had taken up residence behind my stove. I remember nights in January when the heating system would fail, and I would sit on my second-hand mattress wearing a winter coat, eating 50-cent instant noodles, listening to police sirens wailing down the avenue. While I lived like I was on the brink of eviction, I was working 80 hours a week as a financial consultant. I took every extra project, every weekend shift, every grueling assignment no one else wanted. I was making excellent money, but no one knew. I drove the same beat-up car, I wore the same 4 professional outfits on rotation, and I politely declined every expensive happy hour invitation from my colleagues. I took every single paycheck, kept just enough to cover my miserable rent and basic groceries, and aggressively pumped the rest, usually around 70% of my income, straight into the market. I paired my aggressive savings rate with the $150,000 seed money, diversifying into high-yield index funds, emerging market stocks, and commercial real estate investment trusts. I didn't do it alone. I had one secret ally. Uncle Harrison, my mother's older brother. He was a retired accountant and the polar opposite of my mother. He was quiet, calculating, and kept his mouth shut. When I got the inheritance, I went to him. I showed him my plan. He looked at me, smiled a genuine, proud smile, and spent the next decade quietly advising me, helping me navigate tax loopholes and compound interest strategies. He knew I was living in a dump. He knew I was grinding my bones to dust. And he kept my secret perfectly. I watched my portfolio grow from a respectable sum to $500,000, then to $600,000, and finally, creeping past the $1 million mark. Every rat I chased away, every freezing night, every ignored birthday from my family was just fuel for the furnace. There is one specific memory from those 10 grueling years that cemented the ice around my heart and guaranteed I would never feel guilty about hiding my wealth from my family. It was Thanksgiving Day, 2021. I was 30 years old. A few weeks prior, the market had presented a massive, fleeting opportunity in a tech sector index, and I had aggressively moved a massive chunk of my liquid cash into the investment. It was a brilliant financial move, but it left my checking account temporarily drained down to double digits until my next paycheck cleared. I couldn't afford a flight home for the holidays. Even if I could, I didn't want to spend the money. I called my mother a week before Thanksgiving to let her know I wouldn't make it. There was no sympathy, no offer to help with a ticket. She just sighed heavily into the receiver and said, "Well, Penelope, that is a shame. Mackenzie is bringing her new boyfriend, and we were hoping for a full table. But I suppose if you can't manage your finances well enough to buy a simple plane ticket, we will just have to make do without you." Then she hung up. I spent that Thanksgiving completely alone in my freezing industrial apartment. I bought a frozen turkey dinner from the corner bodega for $3 and heated it up in a microwave that sparked if you ran it longer than 2 minutes. I ate it sitting on the floor, watching the snow fall against the single, grime-covered window. The very next morning, I made the mistake of looking at social media. There was a photo of my family around a massive, beautifully decorated table. But it was the caption that broke something inside me forever. My mother had written a long, gushing paragraph about how thankful she was for her beautiful family, and how she and Gordon were so proud to announce that they had just co-signed a $50,000 business loan for Mackenzie's new boutique clothing store venture. $50,000. For a girl who had never held down a job for more than 8 months. They happily risked their own retirement to fund my sister's delusional hobbies, while leaving me alone in the freezing cold because I couldn't afford a $400 flight. Mackenzie's boutique, predictably, went bankrupt 6 months later, leaving my parents to eat the debt. They never spoke of it again. Sitting on that cold floor, I realized with absolute clarity that I did not have a family. I had a genetics arrangement. And from that day forward, my pursuit of financial independence wasn't just about security. It was about pure, unadulterated freedom from their toxicity. I snapped back to the present, shaking off the ghosts of that cold Thanksgiving. I was standing in my magnificent Pinecrest bathroom, but it was time to put on the costume. It was time to become the Penelope they expected to see. I walked into my expansive closet, past the racks of tailored silk blouses and Italian leather shoes I wore for my high-profile client meetings, and walked to the very back corner. I pulled out a faded navy blue wrap dress I had purchased on clearance 4 years ago. It wasn't ragged, but it looked tired. It looked like the wardrobe of a woman who was just barely scraping by. I paired it with a pair of sensible, slightly scuffed black flats. I pulled my hair back into a severe, simple bun, applying only the barest minimum of makeup. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked ordinary. I looked forgettable. I looked exactly like the failure they needed me to be in order to feel good about themselves. I picked up the heavy box containing the $850 crystal vase, grabbed my keys, and walked out through my gourmet kitchen, setting the advanced security system on my way out. I walked into my 3-car garage and bypassed the sleek, black luxury sedan I had recently treated myself to. Instead, I clicked the fob for my 2019 Toyota Camry. I kept the Camry specifically for family events and running errands in less secure neighborhoods. It was reliable, remarkably clean, and screamed middle-class mediocrity. I placed the vase in the passenger seat and started the engine. The drive from the quiet, tree-lined streets of Pinecrest to the bustling, neon-lit downtown core took about 40 minutes. As I navigated the evening traffic, I mentally prepared myself for the onslaught. I knew the choreography of these family dinners by heart. I knew the exact moments my mother would deliver a backhanded compliment about my weight or my hair. I knew the precise tone my father would use to dismiss my career. And I knew that Mackenzie would spend the entire evening sucking up all the oxygen in the room with exaggerated tales of her own importance. I took a deep breath, feeling the smooth leather of the steering wheel. Let them talk, I told myself. Let them gloat. I was holding a royal flush, and tonight, I was finally going to call their bluff. I pulled up to the valet stand of the steakhouse, handed the keys of my modest Camry to the attendant, and walked toward the heavy oak doors, ready to play my part in the charade one last time. If you find this video interesting, please take a second to press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you very much. The air inside the restaurant was thick with the scent of aged beef, expensive red wine, and the kind of suffocating pretension that only the upper middle class can truly master. I followed the hostess through the maze of white-clothed tables, clutching the heavy box containing the crystal vase. When we reached the designated area, I saw them. My family. They were already seated in a prime booth near the center of the room, looking like a portrait of suburban success. My father, Gordon, was wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and my mother, Brenda, was draped in a silk scarf, her jewelry catching the light every time she moved. And then there was Mackenzie. She was at the head of the table, naturally, surrounded by 3 of her friends who looked like they had been cloned from a lifestyle magazine. As I approached, the conversation didn't stop. In fact, no one even looked up until the hostess pulled out the chair at the very end of the table, right next to the high-traffic walkway. It was the afterthought seat. "Oh, you're here," my mother said, her eyes flicking down to my navy blue dress with a look of mild disappointment. She didn't stand up. She didn't offer a hug. She just gestured vaguely toward the chair. "Set your things down, Penelope. You're late. We already ordered the appetizers." Traffic was heavy downtown, I said quietly, sliding into the seat. Well, you should have planned better, my father grunted, not looking away from his menu. Mackenzie managed to get here 20 minutes early, and she had to drive all the way from her new office. But I suppose time management has never been your strong suit. I didn't argue. I placed the gift on the floor by my feet and looked around the table. Mackenzie was mid-sentence, recounting a story about her high-stakes meeting earlier that week. Her friends were nodding eagerly, hanging on every word. I caught my sister's eye for a brief second. She didn't smile. She just gave me a curt nod, the kind you give a distant acquaintance you're obligated to acknowledge, before turning back to her audience. The waiter arrived a moment later to take my drink order. Just a glass of the house red, please, I said. My mother made a small tisk ing sound. Honestly, Penelope. It's my 60th birthday. At least order something from the reserve list. Or can you not afford the markup? Don't worry, Mackenzie said she's covering the starters, so you don't have to be so frugal tonight. The friends giggled. I felt the familiar sting of their condescension, but I simply smiled at the waiter. The house red is fine, thank you. As the waiter left, I settled into my role as the invisible observer. I watched my parents fawn over Mackenzie, hanging on her every word as she described her promising career trajectory. I listened to them discuss family vacations they had taken without me, and plans for the upcoming holidays that clearly didn't involve a seat for the quiet one. It was a masterclass in exclusion. For years, this environment would have made me want to shrink until I disappeared. But tonight, it felt different. I felt like a scientist observing a dying species through a thick pane of glass. They were so busy performing for each other, so consumed by the fake sparkle of Mackenzie's life, that they couldn't see the reality sitting right in front of them. I took a slow sip of my water, feeling the weight of the deed in my mind, and waited for the show to truly begin. For the next 45 minutes, the table belonged entirely to Mackenzie. It was a relentless, exhausting monologue of self-promotion. She talked about her promotion to a senior assistant manager role, conveniently omitting the fact that she was the only person in her department. She talked about her exclusive new apartment, which I knew for a fact was being heavily subsidized by my parents' monthly emergency transfers. And then, of course, there was the car. It's a BMW 4 Series, Mackenzie told her friends, her voice loud enough to carry to the neighboring tables. Mineral white with the cognac leather interior. The handling is just incredible. I couldn't go back to driving anything else. It really changes how people look at you when you pull up to a client meeting, you know? Oh, we know, my mother chimed in, her face glowing with pride. It's so important to project the right image, Mackenzie. Your father and I always said that. You have to look like success to attract success. It's a shame your sister hasn't quite grasped that concept yet. She threw a pointed look at my sensible navy dress. I'm just happy with my Toyota, Mom, I said mildly. It gets me from point A to point B without any drama. Mackenzie laughed, a sharp, patronizing sound. Point A to point B? Penelope, that's so utilitarian. Life is about the journey, not just the destination. But I guess when you're working a government-adjacent consulting job, you don't really have to worry about prestige. It must be nice to have so little pressure. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the expensive watch on her wrist that was probably financed at 18% interest. I saw the designer bag on the seat beside her that probably cost more than her rent. She was a hollow shell of debt and vanity, held together by our parents' enabling. And yet, in their eyes, she was the victor. So, Mackenzie, one of her friends asked, are you still planning on buying that condo in the Highlands? The one with the rooftop garden? Mackenzie hesitated for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in the armor. Oh, definitely. We're just waiting for the right unit to come on the market. The market is so volatile right now, you have to be strategic. My broker says I'm in a perfect position to pounce when the time is right. My father nodded sagely. That's my girl. Smart. Calculated. You don't just throw your money away on rent forever. You build equity. You build a legacy. That's what separates the leaders from the followers. He didn't look at me when he said followers, but he didn't have to. The implication was as heavy as the steak on his plate. I sat there, mentally calculating the math. Mackenzie's legacy was a house of cards built on leased luxury and my parents' dwindling savings. My mediocre life, meanwhile, consisted of a $750,000 estate that I owned outright, and a diversified portfolio that was currently generating more passive income than Mackenzie's gross annual salary. I felt a strange sense of vertigo. It was as if we were living in two completely different dimensions. In their dimension, I was a failure because I didn't have a cognac leather interior. In mine, I was the only person at the table who was truly free. I took another sip of my house red, which was actually quite decent, and felt a surge of gratitude for Grandma Josephine. She had taught me that the only image that matters is the one you see when you look at your bank balance in the middle of the night. The tension at the table was just beginning to reach that familiar, low-grade simmer when I saw a familiar figure weaving through the restaurant. It was Uncle Harrison. He was my mother's older brother, a man who had spent 40 years as a high-level accountant and had the no-nonsense attitude to match. He was wearing a rumpled corduroy jacket and looked like he had just come from a library, which was exactly why I loved him. "Sorry I'm late, Brenda," Harrison said, pulling a chair up to the end of the table next to me. He ignored the seating hierarchy completely, leaning over to give me a genuine, bone-crushing hug. "Penelope. Good to see you, kiddo. You're looking well. Healthy. Rested." "Thanks, Uncle Harrison," I said, feeling a genuine smile break through my mask for the first time that night. "You too." My mother's smile tightened. "Harrison, you're just in time. Mackenzie was just telling us about her new career milestones. We were having such a lovely discussion about success and planning for the future." Harrison grunted as he signaled the waiter for a scotch. "Success, huh? That's a broad topic. Hope you're taking notes, Mackenzie. It takes more than a fancy car to keep the lights on when the wind starts blowing." Mackenzie rolled her eyes. "Oh, Uncle Harrison. You're such a pessimist. Some of us actually believe in growth and taking risks." "Taking risks is fine if you own the parachute," Harrison countered. He turned back to me, his eyes twinkling with a secret we had shared for a decade. "Speaking of growth, Penelope, how have you been? I haven't seen you since the big day." I felt my heart skip a beat. I knew exactly what he was referring to. 3 weeks ago, Harrison had been the only person I invited to the final walkthrough of my new home. He had stood in that massive kitchen, looked at the panoramic views of Pinecrest, and told me that his sister Josephine would have been damn proud. "I've been great, Uncle Harrison," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Just settling in. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it." "I bet it is," Harrison said, leaning back as his drink arrived. "That's a hell of a transition. From that little place in the South District to a spread like that? It takes a lot of guts to stay the course for 10 years. Most people would have cracked after year 3. My mother paused, her wine glass halfway to her lips. "What are you talking about, Harrison? What transition?" "Penelope is still in that apartment on 4th Street. She's been there forever." Harrison blinked, looking genuinely confused. He looked at me, then at my mother, then back to me. The silence at the table suddenly became very heavy. The clinking of silverware from the surrounding tables seemed to grow louder in the vacuum of our conversation. "Wait," Harrison said, his voice dropping into that slow, methodical tone he used when he was about to point out a glaring error in a spreadsheet. "You mean you haven't told them?" "Penelope," I thought. "I mean, you've already moved in. The closing was weeks ago." "Harrison, what are you talking about?" my father demanded, his brow furrowing. "Penelope hasn't closed on anything. She can barely afford her rent. We have to help her with her car insurance every other year." Harrison looked at me, a look of dawning realization crossing his face. He looked horrified. Oh. Oh, Penelope. I am so sorry. I thought. I assumed this was the big reveal. I thought that's why we were all here. Reveal what? Mackenzie snapped, her voice high and sharp. What is he talking about, Penelope? I felt the entire table's focus shift. It was like a spotlight had suddenly swung around and blinded me. I looked at Uncle Harrison, who looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Then I looked at my parents, whose expressions were a mix of confusion and mounting irritation. And finally, I looked at Mackenzie, whose face was twisted in a mask of pure, ugly suspicion. The charade was over. The glass was about to shatter. I took a deep breath, sat up straight, and met my father's gaze. The silence that followed Uncle Harrison's slip-up was the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster. It was heavy, pressurized, and absolute. The waiter chose that exact moment to arrive with a fresh bottle of champagne. He didn't notice the tension. He just started the elaborate ritual of uncorking the bottle, the soft pop sounding like a gunshot in the quiet booth. A toast, my mother said, her voice sounding brittle and forced. She was trying to steer the ship back into familiar waters. To my 60th year. To family. To Mackenzie's bright future. Everyone raised their glasses, but no one drank. All eyes were still on Harrison, who was staring intensely at his scotch. Harrison, my father said, his voice dangerously low. Finish your sentence. What closing? What moved in? Harrison looked at me, his eyes pleading for a way out. I gave him a small, microscopic nod. The secret was out. There was no point in trying to stuff the smoke back into the bottle. Harrison cleared his throat, his professional accountant voice taking over. Look, I thought you all knew. I honestly did. Penelope has been very private about her finances for the last decade, and I respected that. But given that the transaction is public record now, I didn't think it was a secret anymore. He paused, taking a breath. Penelope just bought a house. And when I say house, I mean an estate. In Pinecrest. $750,000. She paid the entire amount in cash 3 weeks ago. No mortgage. No debt. Cleanest closing I've seen in 30 years. If a bomb had actually detonated in the center of the steakhouse, the reaction couldn't have been more dramatic. My father's face went through an incredible transformation, turning from its usual ruddy pink to a sickly, ash-gray color in less than 3 seconds. My mother's hand jerked, sending a splash of champagne onto the white tablecloth. But it was Mackenzie whose reaction was the most visceral. She didn't just look shocked, she looked offended. Like someone had walked up and slapped her in the face. A house? Mackenzie whispered, her voice trembling. In Pinecrest? For $750,000? In cash? She turned to me, her eyes narrowed into slits. That's impossible. You're lying. You're having Uncle Harrison lie for you to make me look bad on Mom's birthday. That is so pathetic, Penelope. Even for you. It's not a lie, Mackenzie, I said, my voice sounding incredibly calm, even to my own ears. It was the calm of someone who has already won the game. Then where did you get the money? My mother shrieked, her voice drawing looks from the neighboring tables. You work at a mid-level firm. What do you make? 40,000? 50,000? You couldn't save $750,000 in 100 years. I make significantly more than that, Mom, I said. But you never asked, so I never told you. Did you steal it? Mackenzie demanded, leaning across the table. Her friends were staring at us with wide, horrified eyes. Are you in some kind of trouble? Is this some kind of scam? There is no way you have that kind of money. None. I didn't answer her. I didn't get angry. I simply reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and opened the digital folder where I kept my legal documents. I scrolled to the final, signed deed of sale, the one with the county recorder's official seal. I placed the phone in the center of the table and slid it toward my father. "Look for yourself, Dad," I said. Property address, 847 Maple Street, Pinecrest. Owner, Penelope Catherine Morrison. Purchase price, $750,000. Current balance, $0.00. My father grabbed the phone, his hands shaking so much he almost dropped it. My mother and Mackenzie crowded around him, their heads nearly touching as they stared at the screen. I watched them. I watched the realization sink in. I watched the world they had built, the world where I was the loser and Mackenzie was the star, crumble into dust right there on the table. The atmosphere at the table shifted from shock to a toxic, frantic kind of desperation. My father was scrolling through the document, his thumb moving frantically across the screen as if he expected the words to change if he looked at them hard enough. This has to be a mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking. "The county recorder? This looks official, but maybe it's a typo. Maybe it's 75,000? A small condo?" "It's not a typo, Gordon," Harrison said firmly. "I saw the wire transfer. I saw the title insurance. It's a 5-bedroom, 4-bathroom estate on 2 acres of land. It's the real deal." My mother looked up from the phone, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "And you knew? You knew about this for 3 weeks and you didn't tell us? Your own sister? Your own parents?" "I've known for 10 years, Brenda," Harrison corrected her. "I've been helping her manage her investments since she turned 25. I kept my word because Penelope is an adult who earned every cent of that money, and she has every right to decide who knows about it." Mackenzie suddenly slammed her hand down on the table, making the silverware jump. 10 years? You've been hiding this for 10 years? While I was struggling to start my business? While I was working my ass off? You just sat there with $750,000 in the bank and watched us? You weren't struggling, Mackenzie, I said, my voice hardening. You were spending. You were spending Mom and Dad's money on vacations and clothes and a lifestyle you didn't earn. And as for me sitting there, I wasn't sitting. I was working 80 hours a week. I was living in an apartment with rats and no heat. I was eating rice and beans while you were posting photos from Tulum. That's not the point, my mother cried. We're a family. Families don't keep secrets like this. We could have used that money. We could have invested it together. We could have helped Mackenzie get her boutique off the ground instead of taking out those loans. I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my chest. Help Mackenzie? Mom, you gave her $50,000 3 years ago. She blew it in 6 months. Why would I give my hard-earned savings to a black hole of vanity? I did exactly what Grandma Josephine told me to do. I built a fortress. The mention of Grandma Josephine acted like a bucket of ice water. My mother's expression shifted from anger to something much more complicated. Guilt. What does your grandmother have to do with this? My father asked, his voice trembling. Everything, I said. Where do you think the seed money came from? It came from the trust she left me. The $150,000 she specifically told me not to tell you about. Because she knew. She knew you'd spend it on appearances. She knew you'd give it to Mackenzie to waste on another failed startup. She wanted me to have a foundation. A real one. That money was supposed to be for emergencies, my mother shouted. It wasn't for you to go off and play millionaire while your family struggled. I wasn't playing, Mom, I said, leaning forward. I was surviving. I lived in that dump on the south side for a decade so I could turn that inheritance into a life. And in those 10 years, do you know how many times you came to see me? 0. Do you know how many times you asked why I was living there or if I needed help? 0. You only cared about how my life looked to your friends. And since it didn't look like much, you just decided I didn't matter. That's not true, my father whispered, but he couldn't meet my eyes. Isn't it? I asked. Mackenzie gets a BMW for being Mackenzie. I get a lecture about my car insurance. Mackenzie gets a $50,000 loan. I get told I'm a disappointment on your birthday voicemail because my dress might not be nice enough for Mackenzie's friends. You didn't lose a daughter today, Mom. You lost a ghost you never bothered to haunt. The restaurant around us seemed to fade away. The other diners, the soft jazz, the clinking of glasses, it all became background noise. The only thing that existed was the cold, hard reality sitting between us on that table. So, what now? Mackenzie asked, her voice dripping with venom. You've had your fun. You humiliated us in front of my friends. You proved you're the smart one. Are you happy now, Penelope? Do you feel big? I don't feel anything, Mackenzie, I said, and I realized it was the truth. The anger I had carried for a decade had suddenly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a quiet, hollow clarity. I didn't do this to humiliate you. I didn't even do this to prove a point. Uncle Harrison made a mistake, but honestly? I'm glad he did. I'm tired of wearing the mask. You're being dramatic, my mother said, wiping her eyes with a silk napkin. We love you, Penelope. We've always loved you. Maybe we were a little focused on Mackenzie, but she needed us more. You were always so independent. So strong. We thought you were fine. You thought I was fine because it was easier than caring, I countered. It's easy to ignore the child who doesn't scream. But being independent doesn't mean I didn't need a mother. It doesn't mean I didn't want my father to ask about my job or my life without comparing it unfavorably to my sister's. You didn't even know I was a senior consultant. You didn't even know I traveled to Europe 3 times last year for work. You didn't know because every time I tried to talk, you interrupted me to tell me about Mackenzie's new haircut or her latest drama with a boyfriend. My father looked at the phone again, then at me. 847 Maple Street. That's near the country club, isn't it? It is, I said. I can see the 4th hole from my back deck. The deck I built with my own hands, by the way. We could come over, my mother said, her voice suddenly hopeful, a predatory glint appearing in her eyes. We could help you decorate. Mackenzie has such a great eye for interiors. We could make it a real family home. I looked at her, truly amazed by her audacity. Even now, after everything, she was trying to find a way to colonize my success. She wanted to turn my fortress into another stage for her vanity. No, I said, the word ringing out like a bell. You won't be helping me decorate. And you won't be moving in. This isn't a family home, Mom. It's my home. Mine. It's the result of 10 years of being invisible. It's the place I go to be away from the other one comments and the constant comparisons. You can't be serious, Mackenzie scoffed. You're going to shut us out? Just like that? Because of a few years of favoritism? Get over yourself. Everyone has family drama. It wasn't a few years, Mackenzie, I said. It was a lifetime. And it's not drama. It's a boundary. I'm done being the backup singer in the Mackenzie show. I stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. I reached down and picked up the heavy box from the floor. I placed it on the table in front of my mother. Happy birthday, Mom, I said. It's the crystal vase you wanted. It cost $850. I paid cash. I hope you like it. It's beautiful, expensive, and entirely hollow. Just like the image you've spent your whole life trying to maintain. I looked at Uncle Harrison and gave him a small, sad smile. Thanks for everything, Harrison. I'll call you tomorrow. Penelope, wait, my father called out, but I was already moving. I walked through the restaurant, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. I didn't look back. I didn't check to see if they were following me. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The valet brought my Camry around a moment later. I tipped him $20, cash, of course, and slid into the driver's seat. As I pulled away from the curb, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. For the first time in 35 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt solid. I felt heavy. I felt real. The drive back to Pinecrest was the most peaceful 40 minutes of my life. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove, watching the city lights fade into the rearview mirror as I headed toward the quiet, tree-lined suburbs. About halfway home, my phone began to buzz incessantly in the center console. I didn't have to look to know what it was. I had connected it to the car system, and the notifications began to scroll across the dashboard screen. Mackenzie, you are a selfish, manipulative bitch. You ruined Mom's night for a power trip. Don't think we're going to forget this. Brenda, Penelope, please answer. We were just shocked. We didn't mean those things. We're your family. We need to talk about the house and your future. Call me immediately. Mackenzie, how much of Grandma's money is left? You owe Mom a share of that inheritance. It was hers by right. I reached out and pressed the Do Not Disturb button on my steering wheel. The screen went dark. The silence returned. It was amazing how easy it was to silence the noise when you finally realized you didn't have to listen. I pulled into the long, winding driveway of my estate. The motion sensor lights flickered on, illuminating the stone facade and the dark, elegant lines of the house. My house. I pulled the Camry into the third bay of the garage, right next to my black luxury sedan. I sat there for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. 10 years. 3,650 days of grinding, saving, and hiding. I thought about the rats in my old apartment. I thought about the frozen turkey dinner on the floor. I thought about the look on Mackenzie's face when she realized her leased BMW was nothing compared to my paid-off empire. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that I had done it all without them. I hadn't asked for their help, their approval, or their validation. And because of that, they had no power over me. I walked into the kitchen, the soft glow of the under-cabinet lighting welcoming me home. I poured myself a glass of water, filtered, cold, and perfect, and walked out onto the back deck. The air was crisp, and the view of the valley below was breathtaking. I could see the distant lights of the country club where my father spent his weekends pretending to be more successful than he was. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the owner of my own life. I realized then that the fortress Grandma Josephine told me to build wasn't just made of brick and mortar. It was made of the boundaries I had finally found the courage to set. I looked at the dark woods surrounding my property and felt a profound sense of peace. Tomorrow, the fallout would continue. Tomorrow, there would be more messages, more guilt trips, more demands. But tonight, I was going to sleep in a house that belonged entirely to me, in a life that no one else could touch. 2 months later, the air in Pinecrest was warm and smelled of blooming jasmine and charcoal smoke. I stood on my back deck, but I wasn't alone. The yard below was filled with people, real people. There was Sarah, my best friend since college, who had helped me move my meager belongings into that rat-infested apartment 10 years ago and never once judged me for it. There was Marcus, my old boss, who had seen my potential and pushed me to take the high-stakes consulting gigs that had built my portfolio. And, of course, there was Uncle Harrison, who was currently at the grill, arguing with Marcus about the proper way to sear a ribeye. These were the people who knew me. Really knew me. They knew about my struggles, my wins, and my quiet obsession with financial freedom. They hadn't needed a reveal to see my value. They had been there all along, celebrating the small milestones while my family of origin was busy ignoring the big ones. Harrison walked over to me, handing me a cold drink. "Doing okay, kiddo?" "I'm perfect, Harrison," I said, looking at the laughter and light filling my yard. "Better than perfect." "I saw your mother last week," Harrison said, his voice lowering. "She's still telling everyone at the club that she advised you on the Pinecrest purchase. She says the crystal vase you gave her is a family heirloom now." I chuckled, but it didn't hurt. Of course she is. Let her have the story, Harrison. It's all she has left. They've been asking for your address, you know, he added. Gordon tried to bribe me with a box of Cuban cigars for the GPS coordinates. And I told him I don't smoke, Harrison grinned. I told him if he wanted to see his daughter, he should try being a father first. He didn't like that very much. Thank you, Harrison. For everything. I looked around at my estate, at the life I had built brick by brick while no one was watching. I realized that my revenge wasn't the humiliating dinner or the secret wealth. My revenge was this: I was happy. Truly, deeply happy. I had replaced the family I was born into with the family I had chosen. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for the money or the house, but for the girl who had sat on that cold floor eating a $3 turkey dinner and refused to give up. I had kept my promise to her. I had built the fortress. The doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of more friends. I walked toward the house, my heart light. I didn't need their permission to exist anymore. I didn't need their validation to be successful. I was Penelope Catherine Morrison, sole owner of my home, my future, and my soul. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. So, Reddit. It's been months, and my parents are now leaving desperate voicemails with Uncle Harrison, begging for my address so they can apologize in person and see the new house. Mackenzie has even tried messaging my LinkedIn. They think I'm a cruel, vindictive daughter for hiding my life, publicly humiliating them at the restaurant, and cutting them off completely. Am I the jerk for keeping my $750,000 home a secret and leaving them in the dust? Should I ever give my parents a second chance, or keep the doors to my fortress permanently locked? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and ring the bell so you never miss out on the juiciest family drama. I'll see you in the next story.